Objections against the goodness of Providence considered. Discourse 14 of Discourses on Various Subjects, Volume 2, by John Leland. Psalm 145, verse 9, quote, "The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works," end quote. In my former discourse on these words, several principles were laid down for leading us into right notions of the divine goodness, and the manner in which it is exercised towards his creatures. And then we proceeded to make a general representation of the goodness of Providence towards mankind in this present state. It now remains that we consider the objections which are urged against it, and these are principally drawn from the great difference that is made between some of the human race and others in the distribution of the gifts and blessings of divine providence, or from the variety of evils and miseries to which mankind are subject in this present state, and which could scarce be supposed to be the case if infinite goodness governed the world. First, it is objected against the universal goodness of God that there is great difference made between some and others of the human race in the distribution of the gifts and blessings of divine providence. The matter of fact cannot well be denied. It is true that with regard to the incapacity of men's outward conditions and circumstances, it might easily be shown that the difference arising from thence between some and others in real satisfaction and enjoyment is not near so great as many are apt to imagine, since a low station hath its advantages, and persons in mean circumstances are often free from inconveniences to which those in higher stations and more splendid circumstances are subject. It may be said, therefore, that happiness is in this respect more equally diffused among mankind than it seems to be to a superficial observer. Yet still it must be acknowledged that the goodness of Providence is more remarkably dispensed to some of the human race than to others. Some whole nations are in a more advantageous situation than others, with respect to opportunities of improvement in arts and sciences and useful knowledge, especially in moral and religious knowledge. Nor can it be denied that in the same nation some particular persons have superior geniuses and capacities, finer endowments than others, happier natural tempers and dispositions, better education and instruction, and greater advantages for virtuous improvement. These things are to be regarded as under the direction of divine providence, and this is analogous to its way of acting in all parts of the universe that we are acquainted with, since we may everywhere observe different degrees of excellence and happiness among different species of beings, and among the several individuals of the same species. But granting this to be the truth of the fact, it is not easy to see with what pretense of reason it can be made an objection against the goodness of divine providence. Doth it follow that God is not good, though he doeth much good to all, because the effects of his goodness are extended in a greater measure and degree to some than to others? The goodness of God, as hath been already observed, is the goodness of a sovereign benefactor, who is the absolute Lord of his own gifts. And if he dispenseth the effects of his free benignity to different persons in different proportions, according to his good pleasure, for which undoubtedly he hath always wise reasons, though we may not know those reasons, this must be acknowledged to be an exercise of his sovereignty, but is no real objection against his goodness. It was shown in a former discourse that God hath done a great deal in the course of his providence to promote the knowledge and practice of religion and virtue among mankind. He hath given to all men the light of nature and reason, which, if duly improved, might be of great benefit. And it appears from Scripture that there were important discoveries made to the first ancestors of the human race, which, if carefully preserved and propagated as they ought to have been, might have been of signal use for maintaining a sense of religion and the knowledge and fear of God. And if the nations did in process of time lose or abuse both the light of nature and the additional notices and important traditions derived from the first ages, and which were originally owing to extraordinary revelation, the blame must be charged wholly upon themselves. It was because, quote, they liked not to retain God in their knowledge, end quote, and, quote, became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened, end quote, and they most inexcusably revolted from God to idols, and, quote, served and worshipped the creature more than the Creator, end quote. We are not sufficiently acquainted with the history of mankind to know what helps and advantages God may in his providence have vouchsafed from time to time in different parts of the earth. But it is not improbable that some helps and advantages may have been formerly granted, even to nations which appear now to be the most deeply immersed in ignorance, idolatry, and barbarism, among some of whom there are traces to be found of usages which seem to show that they formerly had some knowledge of the true religion. And if at length they almost entirely extinguished it, it would be an inexcusable rashness to arraign the justice or goodness of God on the account of that which was the effect of their own culpable negligence and corruption. And if God had been graciously pleased to grant more frequent and extraordinary advantages for knowledge and improvement to some other nations, it would be an odd thing in them that are thus highly favored, instead of gratefully acknowledging and adoring the distinguishing goodness of God towards them, to find fault with his providence, because all are not possessed of the same advantages. Their business and duty is to make a right use of their own privileges, and to bless God for them, and as to others that want them, to leave them to the mercy of God, who we may be sure has wise reasons for his procedure towards them, and will deal justly and equitably with them, and will make all proper allowances in the judgment of the great day for the disadvantages they were under. And this is sufficient to satisfy a reasonable and unprejudiced mind, and ought to prevent or silence all murmurings against the divine goodness on that account. I proceed now, secondly, to consider the objection which is brought against the goodness of providence from the evils and miseries that abound in the world, and to which mankind are now subject. These are too many to be distinctly enumerated. How often are men tormented with grievous pains and diseases of body, which occasion the most bitter and dolorous sensations, or they are perplexed with anxious distracting cares, or they meet with vexatious crosses and disappointments, pinching straits and difficulties, and a variety of troubles and sorrows, which in a great measure destroy the comfort of life. Every state and condition hath its uneasiness attending it, from which those that are looked upon to be in the happiest circumstances are not exempted, so that it may be justly said that, quote, man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble, end quote, Job chapter 14, verse 1, to which may be added those calamities which are of a more extensive nature, inclement seasons, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, public devastations, in which whole nations or large communities are involved. This must be acknowledged to be a considerable difficulty, but it ought not to make us doubt of the divine goodness, of which we have so many convincing proofs. It is not to be wondered at that there are some things in the present course of the divine dispensations which we find it hard to account for. This ought to be attributed to the narrowness of our views, and we should be persuaded that all those difficulties would be perfectly cleared up to us if we could behold the whole extent of God's providence and government as taking in all nations and ages, and the reasons and ends of his dispensations in their proper connection and harmony. But besides this general consideration, several things may be offered which will help to take off the force of the objection. First, let it be considered that many of those that are called physical or natural evils are the effects of excellent general laws, which are manifestly for the advantage of the whole. Thus, for example, many of the uneasy or painful sensations which we feel are designed to remind us of supplying the necessities, or repairing the decays of nature, or to put us upon our guard against what would prove pernicious or destructive to our constitution. Of this kind is hunger and thirst, and the pains that accompany hurts or wounds, and broken or dislocated bones, and the sickness which attends a distempered state of body. These things tend to put us upon using proper methods or remedies, and if it were not so, we should be apt to neglect a due care of ourselves, and the maintaining or preserving our constitution, which might in that case fall into ruin before we were aware. By the same law by which pleasure and ease is annexed to a sound constitution of body, sickness and pain must be annexed to an unsound or disordered one. By the same rule that the bodily organs are so disposed as to receive agreeable sensations from certain objects that are fitly proportioned to them, others which are disproportioned to them will occasion disagreeable sensations. For it would be absurd to suppose that our sense should be so constituted as that objects should be alike to them. For this would be to suppose that our sensitive organs should have no determinate power or figure at all, since, if they have, some things will be well fitted to them, and others not, and these must strike the senses in a different manner, except they be so formed as not to be affected by anything at all. And I believe none will say that this would be so good a constitution as the present, or that it would be for our greater advantage and happiness that it should be so. Secondly, it is to be considered that most of the evils and miseries which now disturb human life are owing to men themselves, and are the effects of their sins. And why should Providence be charged with the evils that men bring upon themselves by their own ill conduct? They are indeed very prone to lay the blame of their own miscarriages upon God and his providence. Quote, "The foolishness of a man perverteth his way, and his heart fretteth against the Lord." End quote. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 3. But this is highly unreasonable. Nothing can be more fit and just than that men should suffer by their own sins, and so feel by experience what an, quote, "evil and bitter thing it is," end quote, that they have sinned against God. Men's pride, envy, revenge, discontent, and ungoverned passions do more to embitter their lives than any outward evils whatsoever, which without these would be comparatively light and tolerable. And many even of the outward evils men suffer are brought upon them by their own vices, or at least by their rashness and folly, their wilfulness or negligence, or by the sins and injurious actions of other men. The near conjunction of men in society produceth in general many good effects, and tendeth greatly to the advantage and satisfaction of human life. Yet it often happeneth that in consequence of this conjunction they are exposed to evils from one another's actions, and this cannot be entirely prevented without absolutely excluding them from each other's society and intercourse, which would produce much greater inconveniences, to which may be added that it is very wisely permitted that men should suffer by the sins of others, the more effectually to convince them of the evil of sin, and excite in them an abhorrence of it. When we ourselves are guilty of bad actions, we are apt to be so blinded by our passions, and by our self-love and partiality in our own favour, that we have not a just sense of the evil of such a conduct. But we are made thoroughly sensible of the great evil of injustice, fraud, violence, debauchery, when we or our families suffer under the evil effects of them as done by others. Whosoever thinks impartially must be convinced that there could be no preventing the misery that is in the world without preventing men's sins. If it be urged that a world governed by infinite goodness ought to be so ordered that there should be no misery at all, and therefore no sin, this is in effect to say that in a world governed by infinite goodness, there should be no creatures made with a freedom of moral agency, or endued with a power of choosing or doing good or evil, and of determining their own actions. But since liberty and a self-determining power, reason, and choice are certainly noble faculties, how will it be proved that the making creatures endued with these faculties is inconsistent with infinite wisdom and goodness? And if not the making them, then neither is the governing them according to their natures, that is, governing them as becometh moral agents, and leaving them to their own free choice and liberty, inconsistent with divine goodness. And if they be left to their own free choice, this is to put it in their power to make themselves miserable. But it is sufficient in that case to vindicate the goodness of God, that they shall not be miserable but by their own fault, and that it is in their power by a proper choice and course of action to procure to themselves a high degree of happiness and perfection, vastly superior to what merely sensitive beings are capable of. In a system where there are rational and free agents, by the same wise and excellent rules according to which certain ways of choosing and acting will produce happy and beneficial effects, the contrary choices and actions will have contrary effects, and be productive of evil and hurtful consequences. Nor can this constitution be justly found fault with, but must be acknowledged to be fitly ordered, and to be calculated for the general good. And it is evident that if there were no such creatures as free agents, the world would be far less perfect than now it is, and that there would be much less happiness upon the whole. The happiness they are capable of enjoying is of a more excellent kind than they could have enjoyed if they had not a power of choosing and acting freely. How great is the satisfaction arising from the overcoming great temptations, from constancy, fortitude, and all the pleasing reflections on past trials, and from the gradual improvement of the intellectual and moral powers, till they are made perfectly happy in the noblest exercises and enjoyments. And it shall give a peculiar relish to their felicity, that it shall come to them as the effect of their own conduct, and the reward of their piety and virtue. And, on the other hand, if there be misery in consequence of the ill conduct of rational moral agents, this is not to be charged upon divine providence, since it is wholly owing to their own abuse of the noblest powers, and of the excellent and high prerogative of reason, liberty, and free agency. It might indeed be reasonably expected from the infinite goodness, as well as holiness of God, that he should use all proper methods becoming a moral governor, and consistent with the liberty of moral agents, to hinder them from committing sin, and to engage them to a holy and virtuous practice. And this, as I have had occasion to observe before, he hath done, by implanting in the hearts of men a sense of the beauty and excellency of virtue, and the turpitude and deformity of vice and sin, by the stings and remorse of natural conscience, by the precepts and threatenings of his holy law, forbidding sin, and denouncing the most awful threatenings against it, and by ordering it so that it exposeth men to many evils in this present constitution of things. And what could he be expected to do more, except he exerted his own almighty power to prevent all men sinning, which could not be done without putting a perpetual constraint upon them, and abridging them of their natural liberty and freedom? And yet, after all, it may be justly said that there would be far more of those evils in the world which are the effect of men's sins, if a merciful providence did not interpose, and avert a great deal of the evil that sin would otherwise introduce, and which, were men left merely to themselves, without a wise and good presiding mind, would render the earth tenfold more miserable than it is. Thirdly, another thing that is proper to be considered on this subject is, that many of the things that are accounted evils here on earth are more so in opinion than in reality. And why should the goodness of providence be arraigned for evils, the stings of which lie in the wrong judgment or imagination men form concerning them? Our duty in this case is not to accuse the divine goodness, but to correct our own false opinions of things. Many look upon it to be a great evil that they are in a mean and low condition, and have not such a large portion and affluence of worldly riches and honours as some others. And yet this meanness of condition is more an evil in opinion than in reality. For men may be poor and in low circumstances, and it is proper on several accounts that most of mankind should be so in this present state, and yet may have many mercies and blessings, and as much true enjoyment, and often more, than persons in higher stations, and more splendid outward circumstances. Disappointments are generally regarded as great evils, and yet the evil of them often amounteth to no more than this, that men fall short of expectations which they ought not to have indulged, and which were owing to their having fixed to themselves wrong measures of happiness. The same may be said of anxious perplexing cares, which cause great trouble and vexation, and which a right judgment of things would have prevented or greatly moderated. In general, it must be acknowledged that the evils and miseries of this present life are for the most part magnified and exasperated by men's own passions, and sometimes entirely owing to them. Many there are who have great advantages, but they do not enjoy them, nor are thankful for them as they ought. When they are in circumstances that should make them easy and contented, they create to themselves imaginary evils. This is not properly chargeable on providence, but on their own wrong tempers. And it is but just that that temper which is their sin and fault should also be their punishment. Yet such is the goodness of God, that he hath directed us, both by the reason he hath given us, if duly improved and attended to, and by the instructions of his word, to form right sentiments of things, especially concerning the nature of true happiness. He hath been graciously pleased to forbid our foolishly disquieting and tormenting ourselves, And he alloweth and requireth us to cast our cares and burdens upon him, and to endeavour to keep our appetites and passions within proper bounds, and is ready to encourage and assist us in our sincere endeavours to this purpose. Fourthly, that a great deal of the evils and adverse events which are in the world are overruled to good, and certainly, as was observed in my former discourse, those evils are no just objections against the goodness of divine providence, which are made to produce greater good, and prove beneficial upon the whole. Men indeed, for the most part, judge of good and evil by their present feeling, by the present pleasure or trouble they yield. But this is not a right way of judging. As we are now in a state of trial and discipline, present things are principally to be considered as means to the ultimate happiness of man. And what hath a tendency to promote this, though it may now seem troublesome, is really good. So that in judging of the goodness of providence towards us, we must consider not merely what is at present agreeable or disagreeable to us, but what is suitable for creatures in such a state as this. And in this view, the withholding outward blessings and inflicting outward evils and adversities may be really an act of great goodness. For though to be deprived of earthly comforts and enjoyments, or to be exercised with grievous bodily pains and distempers, or with worldly crosses and disappointments, and other things which give us uneasiness, may seem to be very hard treatment, yet when the matter is duly considered, it will be found that afflictions are necessary in this present state, and answer many valuable and important ends. They are in the nature of a wholesome medicine or discipline, and no man will pretend that it is inconsistent with the goodness or humanity of a physician to prescribe bitter and disagreeable medicines in order to the recovery or establishment of health, or with the tenderness of a good parent to correct a beloved child when it appeareth to be necessary for the child's real benefit. So far is the sending afflictions upon us in this state of trial from arguing any want of goodness in God, that we are taught in Scripture to regard them as instances and proofs of his parental love and care. We are exhorted, quote, not to despise the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when we are rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth, end quote. And we are assured that, quote, he chasteneth us for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness, end quote. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5, 6, and 10. Afflictions are useful many ways. They tend to put men upon serious reflections, to awaken them out of their thoughtless security, and to convince them of the evil of sin, and inspire them with a hatred and abhorrence of it. They tend also to disengage their hearts and affections from this present world, to make them sensible that this is not designed for their proper ultimate portion and felicity, and that it is vain to look for happiness and rest in any earthly enjoyments. They are also often rendered greatly conducive to strengthen and brighten their graces and virtues, and to exercise and improve some of the noblest dispositions of the human nature, and in which much of the beauty and excellency of religion doth consist, such as faith, patience, fortitude, equanimity, resignation, confidence in God under the greatest difficulties, meekness, and the forgiving of injuries. Thus, though, quote, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous, nevertheless, afterwards it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby, end quote. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. It layeth a solid foundation for true satisfaction and happiness, and will enhance the future reward, and both quicken our desires after it, and form us into a greater meetness for it. And shall we find fault with the divine goodness for those things which are designed for such excellent ends? What can be fuller of consolation and encouragement, or have a greater tendency to cause us even to, quote, rejoice in tribulation, end quote, than to be assured that, quote, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, end quote. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Fifthly, many of the evils that are observable in this present state are necessary for the declaration of God's rectoral justice and righteousness, and certainly no objections can lie against the goodness of divine providence, from events which are proper to vindicate the righteousness of it, though this is not a state of final judgment, and therefore, quote, sentence against an evil work is not, end quote, in the ordinary course of things, quote, speedily executed, end quote, yet it is very fit that there should be, even in the present dispensations of divine providence, some awful manifestations of God's just displeasure against sin, without which sinners would be apt to question his holiness and justice, and consequently it is fit that there should be some punishments now inflicted to vindicate the majesty and righteousness of the supreme governor and the authority of his laws, and accordingly many of those evils and calamities that are inflicted on particular persons and large communities must be regarded in this view. This observation may especially be applied to those extraordinary dispensations, which seem to bear upon them signal marks of the divine justice and hatred against sin, and to be designed for warnings to future ages as well as the present. Such were the universal deluge, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the dreadful judgments inflicted upon Jerusalem and the Jewish nation, which, however disastrous to those that suffered them, were no more than they really deserved, and were designed to be of extensive use to mankind in all ages. But though it is for the general good that some such instances and examples there should be, yet it is manifest that in the ordinary course of things there is much forbearance exercised towards sinners in this present state. God is continually doing good in the methods of his bountiful providence, not only to the good and just, but to the unjust, the unthankful, and the evil. And this is so observable that those very persons who accuse the divine providence as defective in goodness towards mankind are at other times ready to turn the goodness and forbearance of God towards sinners into an objection against his righteousness. And it may be justly affirmed upon the whole that there is a great deal more good than evil here on earth, and that the afflictions and adversities of life are very much overbalanced by the blessings and advantages which Providence putteth into our hands, if we will but set ourselves to improve and enjoy them as we ought. Things are so circumstanced as generally to render life not only tolerably easy, but agreeable and desirous to the greater part of mankind. All that can be justly concluded from the evils we now suffer is that this present world is not designed to be the state of our final happiness. The effect they should have upon us should be to keep us from being too fond of life, which otherwise we should be apt to be, and to make us willing to part with it when God calleth us to do so, and to raise our affections and views to a nobler state of existence. And the evils of this life, considered in this view, are not only wisely but graciously ordered, for after all, this is but a small part of our existence, and it is but a little comparatively that we taste and see of the divine goodness in this present state. But what a glorious and ravishing scene will open to us in a better world, when we shall enter upon that blessed, quote, life and immortality, end quote, which is so clearly, quote, brought to light by the gospel, end quote. Then shall sin and sorrow be forever banished, and, quote, God shall wipe away all tears from our eyes, end quote. Quote, O how great is thy goodness, which thou hast laid up for them that fear thee, end quote. No heart can conceive it, much less is any tongue of man able to describe it. In all our contemplations of the goodness of divine providence towards mankind here on earth, we must still carry our views to the heavenly state, where it shall be fully completed, and shall shine forth in its brightest glory to all eternity. I shall conclude with this reflection. What a delightful and comforting consideration is it, that infinite goodness governeth the world, and that all things are under the direction and superintendency of a most wise and benign providence. Happy is the man that liveth under the influence of this persuasion. Whatever be the present appearances of things, he hath a strong security that all things shall certainly be ordered for the best. No difficulties can shock him. The whole face of things looks placid and serene about him. With what satisfaction and complacency may he resign himself and all his concernments to the disposal of his kind and almighty friend, parent, and benefactor. It is true religion, and that alone, which layeth a solid foundation for a comfortable and peaceable life. Far be it from us, on any occasion, to entertain dishonorable thoughts of the divine goodness, much more to break forth into unbecoming reflections upon it. It appeareth from the account which hath been given, that God permitteth no more evil than he overruleth to excellent purposes, and that he ordereth it so, that no man in this present state shall suffer more evil than either he hath deserved by his sins, or than shall turn to his own benefit, if he be careful to make a wise and just improvement of it, and shall also tend to the benefit of others, if they take warning by his patience and virtues. And there is nothing in this but what is perfectly consistent with a wise and good administration. Let us therefore frequently review the instances of God's goodness towards us, and instead of allowing ourselves to find fault, break forth into thankful praises and acknowledgments, saying in the language of the devout psalmist, quote, "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits towards me?" End quote. Psalm 116, verse 12, quote, "Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness, and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Whoso is wise, and will observe these things, even they shall understand the loving kindness of the Lord." End quote. Psalm 107, verses 8 and 43.